and thanks for the invitation to be here virtually with you. We've been doing a lot of this recently. So a little bit about the book. Eric and I wrote a book which we managed to release in the middle of a pandemic when all the bookstores were shut. So basically we're now promoting it a year later. So hence why we're talking about it now, despite the fact that it's been out for over a year. What else can I say about the book? The start of the book, actually, the preface has a little bit of a biography in it that's somewhat illuminating. We met each other when I started to do work for the austerity book. And I started to do work for the austerity book by figuring out that I couldn't talk to academics about this because they all just had fixed positions on this, as they do. You write for 20 years that debt's a bad thing. You're not going to change your mind anytime soon, right? So I wanted to find bond market vigilantes. So I set out to find them. And it turns out that they're actually, some of them at least, are quite reasonable people. What they really care about is the stability of their portfolio. They don't actually want to be holding assets that suddenly lose value, because that really screws up their entire portfolio. So they actually care about stability more than anything else. And I figured this out by starting to go to their conferences. So it turns out bond people and finance people have their own conferences. In fact, I looked into this. There are 1,500 major financial conferences around the world amongst finance professionals every year, which is astonishing when you think about it. The only problem is some of these conferences are quite exclusive. That is to say, to get into them, you need to pay an admissions fee. And unlike going to ISA or something like this, the admissions fee can be $5,000. So there was no way I was going to spend that type of money or have that type of money to go to these conferences. So I basically dialed around a bunch of friends and said, how am I going to get into these things? And they said, well, you need to start talking at these things because you have something that we don't have. And I said, what's that, apart from a cute Scottish accent? And he says, well, no, what it really is you know all the stuff about Europe. We just buy the bonds. I was like, really? He says, yeah, I mean, you know, it's a AAA rated instrument. We just do it for portfolio security. We're not going to shit. So ultimately, you know, German, Greek, whatever, it's all the same to us. It's all rated the same. So, you know, why don't you come in and tell us why that might be a problem? So I did. And I met Eric, who was a hedge fund manager, who basically was saying, this is all going to go pear-shaped very quickly and very badly. And the worst thing you can do is austerity. So obviously we became friends and we were proven correct. And Europe lost a decade of growth. Now, halfway through that, about 2016, we decided we should write another book together because we kind of saw the storm clouds of populism emerging. And the thing is, he runs a fund and I teach and all this, and we never really had time to do this. So we thought what we'd do is basically organize our thoughts amongst certain topics like robotics, aging, labor market stressors, financial crises, and do some reading. And then we'd get together in London and we'd actually just record the talk. So we got some iPhones and we just recorded the whole thing. And we then give it to Surrey to transcribe it. So despite the fact of a Scottish accent and an Irish accent, she actually did a pretty good job transcribing the whole thing. And then when we read it back, it was horrible. It was like another fat, boring book by two fat, boring white guys telling everybody how the world works. And we had it originally in a dialogue, and we thought, well, why not keep it in a dialogue? So we gave it out at NICER in the UK, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, for a kind of like live seminar on it, and said, what do you think of it? And what do you think of the format? And it turned out people loved the format. They thought it was great. Keep it in a dialogue. So we ended up doing that, and I can now report that I am the author of the highest grossing best-selling book written as a dialogue since Plato, because it's probably the only one since Plato. But despite that fact, it's worked out well, because ultimately what we wanted this to be, the book to be, is not a book for academics. It's designed for a 3.5-hour flight for somebody who's broadly interested in why everyone's so pissed off, despite the fact that we've never been materially more rich. And tries to basically talk about the causes of that and also what we might want to do about it. So that's the background to the book. And with that, I will actually talk about it. I'm going to talk till about probably 1:30, and then we can just Q&A until we're done for time. So let me just share the screen and go. There we are. Let me full screen this. Awesome. Here we go. All right. So being bad social scientists, we forgot to actually define it. So what is Angrynomics? And we ended up with this definition after the fact, which is the effect generated when most people in a country believe the economy no longer benefits them. So why might that be the case? Someone sent me this brilliant infographic for the United Kingdom. It's fabulous. So have a look at this. So in 1970, Your salary coming out as a college graduate was 22,006. It's now 23 in inflation adjusted terms. It basically hasn't risen. So much for the college premium and all this nonsense, right? Basically, it's flat, which tells you that everybody else is on real net losses further down the income scale. Average house price used to be 3.4 times the average salary, is now 9.7 times. This is actually probably an underestimate because basically that's an averaging. And that averaging takes in places like Bolton and Birmingham, where people don't actually move. If you actually just do London, it's about 12 times the average salary. So what have we got? The unemployment rate, 6.6% on average, 12.4. So we've doubled graduate unemployment over 50 years, despite banging ever more people through universities. And ultimately, we had no student debt in the UK at all in the 1970s. And now you've got 50,000 quid, that's $80,000 in interest at 6.1 interest in a world of negative real rates. I mean, that's just shit. That's just horrible. So I was surprised by this, but not totally shocked. So I decided, let's have a look at what happens if we do this. I'm going to move you guys over here. If we do this for the United States, and it turns out it's quite illuminating. So back in the 70s, the inflation adjusted degree was 58K, 58.6, and now it's 65. So it's a 10% real increase in 50 years. So at least you got 10%. In Britain, you got nothing. The average house price, again, this is very, very misleading because the average includes Wisconsin as well as Washington. It used to be 156, is now 264. But if you take Boston as a representative growth city you would actually move to, then it's 653. So unemployment, always high in the US, quite surprised by this, 11%, highly variable, but is now about 14%. The average student loan in 1993 was 16,000, and that's effectively gone up to 37,172. Which is way less than the average British student loan. So way to go, Britain. I mean, you've only had student loans for like a decade and you've managed to basically outpace the United States in terms of unpayable debt. That's just kind of awesome. So when I think about that, I then have to ask the following question. Is it any wonder people are pissed off? Because the take home is when you divide the consumer price index by basically wages up to the 60th percentile in the United States, and this is pretty representative of European countries as well, particularly Germany over the past 15 years, is essentially your real wage peaks in 1973. It kind of recovers a little bit by 1980 and then just goes into a terminal slump almost through the 2000s. And you've had some real gains over the past 20 years. It's been basically stagnant since the financial crisis of 2008, however, and it's still below your actual purchasing power where you were in 1973. So given that, is it any wonder people are angry? So in the book, we try and talk about the two faces of anger. So what do we mean by this? So the top one, of course, is the Black Lives Matter movement, and then there's the January the 6th movement on the top and the bottom. Now, it's easy to basically say sort of, one's good and one's bad because, yeah, I would agree one's good and one's bad, but that's not the point. The point is that this type of moral outrage claim, when basically entire communities feel that they are aggrieved, that there is a wrong that refuses to be righted or even recognized by the relevant authorities, that somehow they have been betrayed, which could characterize both the beliefs of both movements, that is absolutely ripe for weaponization in politics. And if you have the stressors of declining real wages and other such stressors, which we'll talk about in a moment, going into this period, then the ability to take those types of anger and weaponize them in politics, as we say, basically tribal anger, becomes, if you will, the sort of the litmus test of much politics. What we're also interested in is basically the private side of anger. If you go up to an Extinction Rebellion protester and ask them, are you feeling okay? Do you need a hug? You're probably going to get a punch in the face and you probably deserve it. But, most of the time our anger tends to be directed towards family. It tends to be directed towards work colleagues. It's to do with those everyday stressors of life. And if we look at everything, for example, the spirit level tables and the work that's been done from there, if you look at the epidemiological correlates of inequality and basically job market related stress, there's an epidemic, as we know, of mental health and substance abuse and self-medication, etc. So we're working longer, we're working harder, we're working in more insecure conditions, and basically we feel shit about it. So there's a micro side to this, which you see in private anger, and a very macro side that you see in public anger. So if you think about this in the sort of information terms, what is it that you get by analyzing both of these sides of anger? So anger is often seen as a moral outrage and a desire to be heard. Anger is a reaction to no one cares about this particular community. Anger is a reaction to off-limits areas of concern, things that you cannot talk about, because if you do, you are seen to be somehow beyond the pale of concern. And you see this right across the board with failure of representative institutions and political parties. If you think about the European context and the absolute transformation of so many party systems that were very, very stable over the past 10 years, if you think about parties that are now features of government, such as Five Star and Podemos, which simply didn't exist if it wasn't for these types of mass anger movements. If you think about the rise of AfD in Germany, if you think about the complete collapse of the French socialists, there's been a lot of basically public disquiet with existing arrangements. You also see this with the rise of anti-immigration politics. This is a very sensitive one. What we try and make the case in the book is that immigration is felt differentially across the income distribution. A short version of it would be, when I deal with an immigrant, it's somebody else who's coming to a very expensive university with a PhD, or a graduate student, or an international student whose parents can afford exorbitant fees. If I'm living in East German public housing and I've been told for the past 30 years that I'm a loser and there's no more welfare for you, and suddenly you're talking about increasing the migration into the country by 2 million, you can see how that can be both anger increasing and also weaponized in politics very effectively. So those types of, if you will, off-limits areas of political concern can become, if you will, very, very active areas of political contestation very quickly in the right environment. And then the last one, which we really focus on, is how all of this is driven by the collapse of real wage growth and increasing inequalities. The private side of this, again, are the micro stressors that amplify public anger. The one way to think about this is the giant risk shift that has gone, moving risk insurance from firms and governments towards individuals over the past 30 years. As I mentioned, the rise in mental illness and epidemiological correlates of inequality. The stresses from market deregulation, platforming, zero-hour contracts, temporary contracts for large parts of the labour market, franchising operations, which basically exist to make profit through squeezing labour ever harder. And also on top of this, we have this kind of existential threats. The first one being robots are coming to take our jobs, no matter how badly paid they are. And then redundancy for large parts of the population, either in the form of robots or in fact of aging. And I've always been fascinated by the boomers and Gen Xers as a cohort, in the sense that they've had the longest run up in asset prices in human history. And now they're forced to liquidate their assets and move off the stage. And they are not going quietly. They're still the people who vote twice as much as millennials, for example. So putting all this in context, what we try and do is talk about macro Angrynomics and micro Angrynomics. So if this book came about in part through meeting Eric, because I was going to finance conferences to meet bond market vigilantes, this part of the book came about because I started going to tech conferences. And I started going to tech conferences because, again, I don't trust academics to tell me the truth. They're all embedded in their positions. I wanted to go meet tech people because I wanted to find out, are we really all going to be replaced by robots, right? You had that McAfee and Bjornsson book that came out, the Race Against the Machine, which basically, if it had been true, half of you would already be robots. There was the Oxford study that came out shortly thereafter, 50% of all jobs are going to be replaced by robots. And this just seems to be bullshit to me. I'm not buying this one at all. So I started going to tech conferences. And again, we played the games in trade. Turns out tech people are really interested in economics, but don't know anything about it. So they really want people to come to their conferences and put all this stuff in context, you know, global supply chains and manufacturing and all that, and tell them how their tech fits in the world. So I was quite happy to play that role, and in return, they got to tell me all about robots, and it is mainly bullshit, frankly. But anyway, we'll talk about that in the Q&A if you want. What was significant, though, is I had to figure out a way of talking to this audience that made sense, because they're not an economics-friendly audience. So I came up with this analogy, and the analogy was basically capitalism is computers, the idea of hardware, software, and system errors. So in brief, basically, if you think about the German economy, it has a labor market, it has a capital market, it has a certain labor market, it has certain governance institutions, the competition commission, pick your poison. And all capitalist economies basically have the same bits. The hardware is essentially similar, but different in the sense that computers are similar and different. Some of them have more RAM, some of them have more memory, et cetera, et cetera. So American capital markets are far bigger than German capital markets. They both have labor markets. They're very different qualitatively in the type of skills that they produce, et cetera. Software are the economic ideas of a period. They're basically the OS that runs the system. So if you think, from the post-war period, there's basically an OS based upon kind of Keynesian macro stabilization ideas. And then when you integrate, liberate, privatize, and deregulate, as you do in the 80s and the 90s, and finally globalize, you build a very different type of system, which requires a different set of ideas, namely sort of neoliberal macro. And system errors are bugs in the code, bugs in the ideas, that as the machine is run for longer and longer, essentially the complexity overwhelms the system and it crashes. So if you take that as your, whoops, I pressed the wrong button, sorry about that. Back to this. Come on, there we go. If you take this as your analogy, then what does it tell us? It tells us there's been three main orders. The first one was the gold standard order. The gold standard was open markets, free flows of commodities, people and money, and the limited liberal state. Karl Polanyi basically being, if you will, the top design engineer or critic of the period. The software was classical economics, laissez-faire ideas, and sound money. And the bugs in the software was, Polanyi pointed out, that labor is not a commodity. The basic problem, which we actually have again now in the global system, is that in a system whereby that prioritizes the hoarding, or at least the accumulation of gold through trade surpluses, you're going to end up with a world in which you've got too many exporters. Too many exporters leads to deflation. The only way you can maintain your market share and your profits is then to squeeze down on labor. So you get persistent deflationary forces, which ultimately lead labor to do things like go nationalist and go communist and start to get kind of cross with everything. That comes to a head, of course, in World War I and the Great Depression, which basically totals that system. So capitalism 2.0 is the reset from this one, the Keynesian order. And what's that? Much more nationalized economies, essentially similar things which traded occasionally in real things, but really shut down flows of finance with capital controls, high taxes and transfers in the form of the welfare state, and a full employment target, replacing any concern with sound money and laissez-faire. Again, the software was Keynesian macro stabilization ideas. And the bugs in the software were basically inflation and the profit squeeze coming up in the 1970s and derailing the system, something Matthias and I wrote about in Bright a couple of years back, which is an article which has been quite well received about that. Another way to think about this was the problem of generalizing Fordism. When you have kind of Fordism in one country, it all relies upon stable relationships between labor and capital, stable supplies of credit, stable supplies of oil as inputs, etc. Once Germany and Japan recover from World War II and become net export platforms, those old deflationary pressures start to come about again, and this destabilizes the ability of any one country to practice that type of model. That then leads to the destruction of lots of capital internally at the time that prices are rising. That pisses off the business class, and you get kind of the neoliberal reset coming from there. That's the system crash, if you will, the 1970s and stagflation. So then the one that we all grew up in was capitalism 3.0, the neoliberal order. The hardware modification that was made to prevent the recurrence of the bug in the software last time, inflation, was of course the rise of independent central banks and inflation targeting. But we also changed the plumbing of the global economy. There were no more capital controls. It was free to flow. We privatized, we globalized, we liberalized, and created a much more integrated system, and one in which basically capital is free to restore profits by finding its highest return. The software for this is basically neoclassical economics, and the bugs in the software were wage stagnation, asset bubbles, bank leverage, and inequality. The wage stagnation we've seen basically starts in the 70s because essentially capital gets the whip hand over labor and can move to find its highest return. You get asset bubbles. Why? Because that inequality then leads to all the money being concentrated in the top half of the population, if not the top 10%. That then leads to the formation of asset bubbles. Those asset bubbles are basically the assets, quote unquote, of banks, which leads to excessive bank leverage. And then how do you keep the whole system going? You do it by, especially in the Anglo countries, liberalizing the banking sector and massively increasing supplies of credit to consumers so they can continue to consume even if the real wages aren't growing, all of which becomes the bank's assets, which ultimately show up as liabilities in the public balance sheet when you get a system crash, which is what you get in 2008. So The problem that we see is after 2008, and this is sort of where to bring it to the present, there was no reset, right? Central banks bailed out the system with massive liquidity infusions. None of the underlying bugs of wage stagnation, excessive inequality, asset bubbles, financial fragility, indebting young people so that they don't form assets, none of those things are addressed. We just double down on the same system. In a way, ideationally, although there has been counter movements which have been very important, particularly MMT, in basically deprogramming the fear of government debt, there is actually no general macro reformulation that tells us a different sort of set of software is possible, nor have we actually changed the hardware in any fundamental way, except in political architectures. So the hardware is still the same, the software is patched. We then spent 10 years squeezing budgets, which just basically made things worse. And the result was the economics that we're used to becomes Angrynomics. So what's the micro side of this? Capitalism is a stress machine. Particularly over the past 20 years, there's been a lot of more stressful modifications of the micro side of this. And just we detail some of them in the book. So if you think of these as hardware modifications, deunionization and labor market liberalization, what has that actually done? Well, it's increased inequality and precarious work and contingent contracts and cut benefits. Product market liberalization, we don't often think about this. We think about labor markets, but if you do a Gini coefficient for profits, you'll find that the profits are more unequally distributed even than wages. And what that suggests is the vast majority of firms actually don't earn very much money at all. In fact, a lot of them are not profitable. Italy is a case in point for this. They're just kept alive on life support as kind of like job creation machines. The problem with this over time is it means that their margins are incredibly tight. And even if they wanted to raise wages, they absolutely couldn't. So margins get squeezed, wages stagnate, profit dispersal widens. You end up with a highly unequal political economy in terms of the distribution of firms as well as the distribution of labor market outcomes. You get financial market liberalization. Well, that was good, right? Well, yeah, but you get credit bubbles and private debt builds up, and basically you still have massive problems with financial fragility, which filters through to a very deep personal level to do with the indebtedness of households and their ability to manage their household balance sheets. And then finally, the globalization of production, which basically increases the capital share at the global level, while the overall wage share stagnates or falls. So to quote Lenin, "Что делается?" What is to be done? How do we calm the anger? So we talk about moving the furniture around. I actually used this analogy after the book came out, but it's a reasonable way of doing it. Think about it this way. If you have a bunch of angry people and you invite them all for dinner and they all face each other Game of Thrones style, it's not going to go very well. If you change the lighting and bring in some mood lights and put in some bean bags and basically hand out some edibles, maybe everybody will feel a bit better and chill out a bit. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is basically increasing intergenerational inequality. It's not just the inequality put of income and wealth. It's the fact that it's held by old people who vote twice as much as young people, and they don't like climate change and they don't want to give anything away. This makes taxing people incredibly hard. The fact that we've got a global minimum tax in the works is actually quite a thing. Whether it passes the US Senate is an entirely different thing that nobody seems to be focused on, because there it's exactly old rich people who are going to torpedo the damn thing. So if you can't raise taxes, how else can you basically create large amounts of revenue that could do something about this? And we're very much enamored with the idea of a citizens' wealth fund financed by financial crashes. The basic story is whenever there's a financial crash, equity loses 50% of value and everybody buys bonds to the point that bonds become negative yields. That means that the government's cost of financing is actually negative. They're paying you to lend to them, a situation that we're actually still in generally. So at that point in time, you should basically issue an extra 20% of debt. You'll find ready buyers at a zero interest rate. And then you buy up all the equities that have been dumped. The net asset position of the state hasn't actually changed. You're not in debt, you've just swapped debt for equity, which is good. That equity always comes back. If it doesn't, it's called the end of the world. And in which case you just basically hold it in a large passive fund and allow it to grow. That usually grows at about net 5 to 6% a year. So if you did that with the US economy back in the envelope, you've got a $20 trillion economy. Let's say you do 20% debt, that's $4 trillion. You buy $4 trillion worth of equities at a 50% discount and compound that at 6% over 10 years, you'll make about $2 trillion without raising any taxes on anybody at all. You could wipe out all student loan debt in the United States. You could do a Green New Deal. You could do all the stuff you want, and you could do it very easily. Building common assets. We're very much interested in the idea of people selling their data to Facebook rather than giving it away. and using this as a UBI seed. Some people think this is stupid because essentially it won't raise enough revenue. I think that's a fair point. I'm happy to talk about that. I'm not actually that interested in UBI personally. This is more Eric than me. But I think it's good in the sense that it's a way of taxing digital companies, because you can always ratchet up how much you want to pay. Foolproofing recessions, actually the pandemic gives proof of concept for this. We did direct monetary transfers at 80% of salary to most of the people across the in Europe and most countries in Europe, and even in the United States and the United Kingdom. And guess what? It didn't blow up the world. So that was good. So there's no need for austerity. You've proven you can do it this way. And ultimately, we've got sort of helicopter money and dual interest rates on the go just now anyway, which is another way of managing these recessionary tendencies. So I think, yeah, that's it. That's all we got on that one.